The night opened with the ring of fine crystal and the scrape of heavy silverware at a high-end downtown chop house, the sort of place where waiters wear pressed black aprons, and the lighting is kept deliberately low enough to obscure what they're charging you for the privilege. I sat facing my future son-in-law Dirk, along with his parents Garrett and Ilse, who had just flown in from Vienna. Dirk had drawn a very particular portrait of me for his family. In their eyes, I was nothing more than a simple retired blue-collar man who whiled away his later years puttering around in a dusty garage. Welcome back to Grandpa's Revenge, the place where family loyalty and hard-won wisdom take center stage. If you're new here, I'm glad you found your way. If this channel has been sitting in your feed, go ahead and tap subscribe so the next story finds you without you having to go looking. Before we get into it, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me when a man senses danger circling his family. Do you think he should speak up immediately or wait until the proof is undeniable? I'd genuinely like to know where you stand. One last thing, some elements of this story have been shaped for the purposes of audio storytelling, and any resemblance to specific real individuals or events is purely coincidental. What matters most here is the message at the heart of it. I wore a plain sport coat, kept my voice quiet, and let Dirk make a loud show of ordering the wine. He relished the part of the wealthy European tech entrepreneur, and I was happy enough to let him perform if it brought Vivian joy. All I wanted was to see my daughter safe and loved. Midway through the main course, Vivian excused herself to find the restroom. The instant her chair slid in and she was out of earshot, everything at that table changed. The warm, courteous English they had been maintaining all evening evaporated on the spot. Garrett and Ilse leaned in toward Dirk, and the three of them slipped seamlessly into fast, thick Austrian German. They kept smiling at me, nodding pleasantly, reading my quiet manner as the contentment of a foolish old man soaking up the expensive surroundings. But they weren't merely gossiping. They dissected my daughter with surgical cruelty. Ilse chuckled softly, dabbing her mouth with a linen napkin, and dismissed Vivian as an unrefined stepping stone, delivered so casually she might have been remarking on the tenderness of the meat. Garrett laughed under his breath, drew a slow sip of wine, and added that her American naivety was certainly proving useful for the visa. I kept my expression perfectly blank. I chewed slowly, eyes settled on my plate. Then Dirk, the man who claimed to love my only child, leaned forward and assured his parents in fluent German that they only had to endure this pathetic charade a little while longer. Once they had Vivian's signature on the massive startup loan, next week he promised he would gradually push me, the embarrassing father completely out of the picture. The old man is clueless. Dirk laughed, lifting his glass in a toast to his parents. I did not yell. I did not flip the heavy walnut table or make a scene. I swallowed my food and wiped my mouth. What Dirk never thought to ask, and what I had never felt the need to advertise, was my history. He had me pegged as an uneducated mechanic. He had no idea I spent 7 years stationed in Vienna during my time in the United States Army. He had no idea that after my service, I spent 30 years as an international logistics director, hammering out ruthless multi-million-dollar supply chain contracts in Zurich. I don't just speak German. I speak it better and far more ruthlessly than Dirk ever could. I sat there in total silence, letting them float inside their arrogant little bubble, quietly calculating. I was measuring the threat to my daughter and coming to terms with the fact that her entire future was sitting across from me, wrapped in a designer suit and a web of lies. A few minutes later, Vivian came back. Her face lit up with pure happiness as she looked at her future husband. Right on cue, the waiter appeared with the leather folder holding the bill. Dirk ran his classic fake reach, patting his tailored jacket pockets with an expression of mock surprise and a practiced show of apology. I calmly reached over and lifted the leather folder from the table. I looked straight into Garrett's eyes, then shifted to Ilse, and finally locked onto Dirk. The smug, condescending smiles were still fixed on their faces. Without breaking eye contact, I said in flawless, unaccented German, "Don't worry about the bill. The clueless old man has it covered. Enjoy your stepping stone." The color drained from Dirk's face so fast he looked like a corpse. Ilse dropped her fork and it rang out against her porcelain plate. Garrett's mouth fell open in stunned, paralyzed silence. All three of them were frozen, stripped of their power in a matter of seconds. I stood, buttoned my jacket, pressed a gentle kiss to Vivian's cheek, and walked out of the restaurant without another word. But the deep satisfaction of that moment didn't hold. Because Vivian, not having understood a single word of German, had no idea what had just taken place. All she saw was her father saying something sharp and foreign to her future in-laws and walking out on them at dinner. By the time I reached the valet stand, I could hear her heels striking the pavement behind me. She was chasing me down. Her eyes were full of angry tears, furious that I had ruined what was meant to be the most important dinner of her life. The cold city air hit my face as I waited at the valet stand. My heart was beating with a slow, heavy rhythm. I had just declared war, and I knew the retaliation would come fast, but I didn't expect the first blow to land from my own daughter. "Dad, what is wrong with you?" Vivian's voice cracked like a whip in the quiet night. She grabbed my arm and spun me around. Her eyes were wide and brimming with tears of humiliation and rage. I have never been so embarrassed in my entire life. "What did you just say to them, Vivian?" I said gently, keeping my voice low and even. "You need to calm down and hear me out. Those people are not who you think they are. I understand German perfectly, and what they were saying about you at that table was unforgivable." But before I could give her the exact words, before I could tell her, they had called her an unrefined stepping stone and a naive ticket to an American visa. The heavy glass doors of the restaurant swung open. Dirk came rushing out into the cold night. He didn't look angry. He looked devastated. It was the most brilliant and sickening performance I had ever witnessed. He practically sprinted toward us, his face pale, both hands raised in a gesture of peaceful surrender. "Darling, please," Dirk said, his voice breaking as he reached Vivian and pulled a protective arm around her shoulders. "Don't be angry with him. It's just a terrible misunderstanding." He turned to me with wide, wounded eyes, playing the perfect victim. Vivian leaned into him, reaching for his comfort, completely blind to the snake curling itself around her. "A misunderstanding." I repeated the words, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You and your parents called my daughter a stepping stone. You laughed about using her for a visa while you rob her blind. Fake startup. Don't stand there and tell me I misread the dialect." "Dirk!" Vivian gasped, looking up at him. "Dirk, is that true?" Dirk let out a heavy, tragic sigh. He gently stroked Vivian's hair and turned to me with an expression of profound pity. "Leonard, I know your German has gotten rusty. I know you learned it in the army decades ago. But surely you can't believe my mother would say something like that." He directed himself entirely at Vivian, his voice thick with false sincerity. "Darling, my mother used a very old Austrian colloquialism. She called you our foundation stone, our anchor. She was saying that you are the heart of our new family, the one who grounds me." And the visa comment, he gave a sad, self-deprecating little chuckle. My father was joking about how strict American immigration is, saying, "Thank God I have you to help me through all the paperwork." It was a compliment, clumsy maybe, but a compliment. I stood there and watched him spin this masterpiece of deception out of thin air. It was flawless. He took their venom and converted it into sugar. He knew precisely what he was doing. He was gaslighting my daughter right in front of me, bending reality so completely that the truth looked like madness. "That is a lie," I said firmly. "Vivian, he is lying to you. I spent 30 years negotiating contracts in Zurich. I know the difference between an anchor and a stepping stone. They were mocking you, but Dirk was relentless." He tightened his arm around Vivian and looked at me with tears rising in his eyes. "Leonard, I know you have never liked me. I know you think I am just some arrogant European trying to take your only daughter away. I know how hard it's been since Carolyn passed away. You have been alone for 10 years, and Vivian is all you have but to sabotage our wedding like this, to humiliate my parents who flew 5,000 miles just to show their support. It is cruel, Leonard. It is just cruel. He weaponized my dead wife. He weaponized my grief. He painted me as a lonely, bitter, xenophobic old man, so terrified of losing his daughter that he would fabricate vicious lies to destroy her happiness." Vivian looked at me, and I watched the exact moment her heart hardened. The trust we had built over 31 years cracked under the weight of Dirk's lies. She was exhausted. The wedding was only 4 weeks away. She was drowning in seating charts and bridal fittings, desperately wanting her perfect fairy tale to hold together. She didn't want to accept that the man she loved was a parasite. It was far easier to believe that her aging father had made a terrible, stubborn mistake. "Dad, how could you?" Vivian whispered, the tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "Dirk has been nothing but kind to you." They arrived with gifts. They raised a glass to our future together. And there you sat, feeding some paranoid fantasy, because the truth that your daughter is choosing her own path is more than you can stomach. "Vivian, Your thinking is clouded right now, I said, moving toward her. Give me a single day. That is all I am asking. One day, and I will show you exactly what kind of man this is. She retreated from my outstretched hand, as though I'd reached across a great divide. Don't. Just don't, Dad. I can't do this anymore. Every time you turn around, you are questioning Dirk's motives. Every time you treat him like he crawled in off the street from somewhere foreign and suspicious. Dirk pressed his face against Vivian's shoulder, manufacturing the image of a man barely holding himself together. I am so sorry, darling. Dirk breathed close to her ear. Everything I did tonight was to make a good impression. I gave it everything I had. Maybe the right thing is for us to leave. Pack up, fly back to Vienna, and call the whole thing off. Watching your family shatter because of me, I cannot do it. No. Vivian choked out, clutching him. Dirk, that is not happening. You are my family now. She swung her gaze back to me, and what lived in her eyes was something far colder than the night air outside. Mom would be ashamed of what you just did, she said quietly. Those 7 words hit harder than any fist ever could. Carolyn and I had anchored our entire marriage around 2 things, honesty and keeping Vivian safe. That promise had been our bedrock, and now the very reflex that was supposed to protect our daughter was the thing splitting us open. Something hollow carved through my chest, a grief so sudden it momentarily stole my words. If accepting the man I love is beyond you, Vivian pressed on her voice, unsteady but certain. Then stay home from the wedding. Don't walk me down the aisle. Don't stand up and toast us. You will have no place in my life until you sit across from Dirk Garrett and Ilsa and offer them a genuine, unqualified apology. I studied my daughter. Head up, shoulders squared, she was a soldier defending a hill she didn't know was already lost. She was pouring herself out for a future blind to the fact that the man she was shielding was the danger. I shifted my eyes to Dirk. There, behind Vivian's back, just beyond the reach of her sight, the performance dissolved. The grief evaporated. His gaze locked onto mine, and a quiet, satisfied smile crept across the corner of his mouth. He had taken the round, and he felt it in his bones. He had cut his target loose from the one person standing between her and him. The valet rolled my car to the curb. The engine ticked over in the quiet, a strange stillness against the hurricane churning inside me. Screaming would cost me everything. That was the ugly arithmetic of gaslighting. He thrived on conflict and chaos. The only currency that defeats it is cold, hard, irrefutable evidence. Dirk's entire gambit depended on me cracking under pressure. He needed my rage. He needed Vivian to watch me come apart so she would have a reason, a clean, emotional reason to push me out for good. I refused to hand him that weapon. My arms dropped slowly to my sides. I let my posture loosen shoulders, falling, wearing the shape of a man who had nothing left to fight with. I met Vivian's eyes with a long, wordless grief. If that is what you want, Vivian, I said, barely above the whisper, I will give you your space. Then I turned, climbed into my car, and pulled the door shut behind me. I kept my eyes forward as the car moved out into the street. I left the 2 of them on that sidewalk, wrapped in the certainty that they had won. I let Dirk enjoy the quiet confidence of a man who believes he has muzzled the threat. But somewhere between one traffic light and the next, the ache in my chest stopped being sorrow and became something else entirely, a resolve so solid it felt almost geological. Dirk pictured me sulking somewhere in my garage, licking my wounds. He believed the fight was finished. He did not understand that a man forged across 30 years in the unforgiving machinery of international logistics does not quit. He retreats to higher ground. He maps the terrain strips the enemy of cover and then moves with precision. Dirk had just committed the defining error of his parasitic career. He had miscalculated what a father is capable of, and in doing so, he had handed me the one thing I needed most: time. The ride home was its own kind of ordeal. No radio, just the low drone of the engine and the dark city scrolling past the glass. Every red light became a small ambush. I would close my eyes for half a second and find Vivian standing there on the pavement, frost in her expression, staring at me like I was someone she'd never met. That image gutted me. It also sharpened me like nothing else could. Street fighting with Dirk in the cold would have finished us permanently. He was a craftsman of manipulation. He thrived on chaos. The louder I got, the quieter and more wounded he would become. Every flash of anger from me was a brushstroke that completed his portrait of me as the unstable one. He was running a psychological operation standard and ruthless isolate the target, discredit the protector. I turned into my driveway and cut the engine. The home was dark and waiting. Carolyn and I had bought this place 30 years back when Vivian was barely out of diapers. The two of us rolled paint on those walls together, and every birthday we stood Vivian against the kitchen doorframe and marked how she'd grown. These days the place had the atmosphere of a monument, a record of something precious that was being quietly erased. I got the door open and walked in. The stillness pressed down immediately. Every instinct I owned, the raw territorial instinct of a parent, screamed at me to dial Vivian's number, to go to her voice, beg her to sit still long enough to hear the truth. I wanted to drive to Vivian's apartment and lay the evidence in front of her until she couldn't look away. But 3 decades of boardroom warfare had burned one principle into me so deep it was nearly reflex. You don't wrestle for control of a narrative your opponent already owns. You find a different arena altogether. I went to the kitchen and brewed a pot of dark roast. My hands weren't shaking anymore. The white-hot shock of the chop house had cooled into something more useful, a focused, almost clinical calm. Dirk's strategy was straightforward. Sever Vivian from me, collapse her support, and leave her with no shelter except him and his family. If I kicked back hard, Vivian would throw herself in front of him. She would fortify the relationship to protect the dream of the wedding she had been building in her mind. So, the only logical play was to do the thing Dirk would never predict. Concede the ground. Let him stand victorious on his little hill. Let him walk right to the end of the rope I was quietly threading out. I settled at the kitchen table and unlocked my phone. I pulled up my thread with Vivian. The last thing she had sent that afternoon, which now felt impossibly distant, was a photo of a centerpiece she was considering for the reception. I composed my reply with the patience of someone defusing something delicate. I stripped out every trace of the vocabulary I reach for, naturally the precise and deliberate language of someone who has spent a lifetime negotiating. Instead, I wrote like a man running on empty too, worn down and set in his ways to fight anymore. I told her the scene at dinner was my fault. I said I was probably too old and too rigid to appreciate European humor. I said that if she was certain Dirk was who she believed him to be, then I would stand aside. I said I needed some distance from the wedding preparations and would wait until she was ready to reach out. I pressed send and put the phone down on the table, face down. That was the most expensive lie I have ever paid for. It sat in my gut like I had just locked the door from the outside, with her still in the room. But operationally, it was a clean, necessary move. By erasing myself from the story Dirk was telling, by stepping out of the role of the aggressive antagonist, I forced him into the open. Strip away the enemy, and the predator eventually has to hunt in plain sight. Arrogance has never learned patience. A Tuesday. Rain coming down in sheets matting the last of the autumn leaves flat against the driveway. The home was holding its breath. 4 days had passed since the chop house fell apart, since I sent that surrender message to Vivian, and in those 4 days not a word had come back. I was honoring my side of the arrangement, playing the part of the man with nothing left. To keep from disappearing into my own head, I turned to the kitchen. Physical work. Hands busy, brain free to rotate the problem, Dirk his family every angle of it without distraction. The quiet in that house had gone from peaceful to suffocating. There used to be afternoons when Vivian would appear without warning, keys skidding across the counter, and within 30 seconds, the whole room would be alive with stories from her architecture firm. Now there was nothing except rain tapping a slow rhythm against the glass. I found a rag and a spray bottle, and went after the granite countertops, first shifting a neglected heap of cooking magazines, old mail, and local newspapers that had accumulated near the toaster. Carolyn, my late wife, would scold me every time that pile grew. I caught myself half smiling at the thought of her voice, tired and fond and gone. When I lifted the heavy ceramic fruit bowl to wipe the counter beneath it, something caught my eye. Tucked underneath was a thick cream-colored sheet of paper, folded sharply into thirds, sitting wildly out of place among the supermarket flyers and electric bills. I recognized that heavy, expensive cardstock the moment I saw it. Dirk had hauled a leather briefcase stuffed with documents exactly like this one to my home 2 weeks earlier. He and Vivian had come by for a casual Sunday lunch. Dirk had commandeered the entire afternoon, talking loudly about his technology startup in Salzburg. He had moved around my kitchen, pulling out official-looking papers and brandishing them as evidence of his imminent global empire. He told Vivian they were commitment letters from high-net-worth European venture capitalists. He even tossed one carelessly onto the counter, laughing and telling me it was the blueprint for the fortune they were about to build. I remember the smirk he aimed in my direction, certain I'd see nothing but an impenetrable wall of foreign text. In the rush of them leaving to catch a film, that particular sheet had been left behind. I had ignored it at the time, writing it off as more of his arrogant theater designed to remind me how small I was. Now my pulse took on a slow, deliberate beat as I slid the paper out from beneath the bowl. I moved to the kitchen island and pressed the folds flat. The logo at the top belonged to no venture capital firm or technology incubator. It was the official crest of a major corporate banks headquartered in Vienna. I knew that institution. Over my 30 years in international logistics, I had moved millions of dollars through their corporate division. They had a well-earned reputation for strict, unforgiving financial enforcement. I fished my reading glasses out of the drawer and settled them on my face. I leaned in. The bold red lettering across the top center of the page did not read letter of intent. The German words printed there were letzte Machnung, final notice. My eyes swept across the text, the legal phrasing translating without effort. German law is written to be merciless in its clarity. There is no room for misreading. This was not a prospectus or an investment summary. It was a formal declaration of default. The creditor was demanding immediate repayment of more than $400,000. The tone of the letter had been stripped of every professional courtesy. No soft language, no negotiating posture, just the blunt edge of institutional authority. It cataloged missed deadlines, broken payment agreements, and ignored legal summons from a local magistrate. Then the second paragraph produced a word that stopped my blood cold. Betrug, fraud. I read that sentence 3 times to be certain my eyes weren't playing tricks. The bank was stating plainly that the original loan had been obtained through false pretenses, fabricated collateral, falsified revenue projections. They were threatening to hand the full file to local authorities for criminal prosecution if the outstanding balance was not cleared by month's end. They spelled out how Dirk had misrepresented his assets and noted that his accounts had already been frozen pending review by the financial regulatory boards. I stood at my kitchen counter, the paper clenched in both hands, the room tilting slightly around me. The deadline printed at the bottom of the page fell exactly 2 weeks from today. That was exactly 3 days after the scheduled wedding. The arithmetic of it hit me like a blunt object to the sternum. He was rushing the wedding, not because he was consumed with love for my daughter. He was rushing the wedding because Austrian authorities were tightening the net around him. He was a fugitive moving through the world in designer clothes paid for with money that wasn't his. He needed Vivian's signature on that startup loan before his European creditors had him in a Vienna prison cell. He planned to drain my daughter's accounts to satisfy his fraudulent debt, and then he and his parents would melt back into Europe, leaving Vivian broke and legally bound to a convicted criminal. I thought about Garrett and Ilse at that chop house, laughing over Vivian being a stepping stone. They knew. They had always known. They hadn't crossed the Atlantic to witness a celebration of love. They had come to secure their son's financial rescue. They had looked at my daughter and seen nothing but an unsuspecting American bank account, full enough to pull their son back from the edge of a prison sentence. They were accomplices in the dismantling of my child. My hands went still. Every trace of the grief and isolation that had been grinding me down over the past several days simply burned away. The hurt of Vivian turning her back on me outside the restaurant was gone, replaced by something cold and precise and mechanical. I was no longer a mourning widower or a discarded father. I was an officer who had just gotten his hands on the enemy's operational plans. 30 years managing international supply chains instills one discipline above all others. You learn to hunt for what is missing. You learn to scrutinize every claim because the cost of being wrong is measured in millions. Dirk was a fraudulent supplier, and I was about to conduct the most thorough audit of his life. He had made a catastrophic miscalculation. His contempt for me, his absolute certainty that the unrefined American father-in-law was barely literate had led him to leave his criminal exposure sitting on my kitchen counter. He assumed I was an old mechanic who would toss foreign paperwork in the bin without a second look. His arrogance had blinded him to the most basic principle of self-preservation. You do not leave ammunition in the home of someone who knows how to use it. I picked up my phone and switched on the camera. I carried the document to the window, where the natural light was strongest. I photographed every centimeter of that paper at the highest resolution my phone could manage, every word, Every banking code, every official signature captured cleanly, front and back. Then I walked to my home office, opened the heavy steel floor safe, and sealed the original inside a protective plastic sleeve. Dirk would never be able to reach it. The chapter where I stayed in the shadows was finished. Dirk wanted to run a high-stakes financial fraud on what he assumed was a trusting family. He was about to find out what it costs to try that against a man who spent 3 decades dismantling fraudulent contractors on an international scale. I had to move quickly, but the execution needed to be flawless. Taking this document straight to Vivian was not an option. Dirk would conjure another masterwork of deception, a banking error, a vengeful business partner, some elaborate alternative. I needed a case so airtight that his charm couldn't find a single seam to exploit. I needed legal architecture that would hold under pressure. It was time to bring in the real firepower. I scrolled through my contacts until I landed on a name I hadn't called in 5 years. Audrey Vance, the most ferocious corporate attorney I had encountered in all my years in logistics. She did not negotiate. She did not lose. I hit call and stood there listening to it, ring ready to begin tearing Dirk Braun's fabricated empire apart from the foundation. 3 rings before she picked up. Audrey Vance never answered on the first ring, an old power habit from our corporate days together, and she had never abandoned it. When her voice came through, it was exactly as I remembered, sharp, immediate, no warmth in it at all, cutting right through the silence of my kitchen. "Leonard," she said, "tell me someone is trying to sue you. I am desperately bored with everything on my desk right now." I didn't return the humor. "Audrey," I said, keeping my voice low and tight, "I need a favor, a significant one. It has nothing to do with corporate work. It involves Vivian." The easy sharpness in her tone evaporated. I heard the sound of something dropping papers hitting a desk. Audrey had known Vivian since she was a little girl, in pigtails chasing butterflies at the company picnic. "Be at my office in 20 minutes, she said, and the line went dead. I drove downtown through streets still slick and dark from the rain. Audrey's downtown office occupied a high-rise built entirely from glass and black steel, a structure conceived to make whoever walked toward it feel the weight of their own insignificance. In my logistics years, whenever a foreign supplier attempted to cheat us on a contract, Audrey was the instrument I reached for. She didn't negotiate terms. She reduced them to rubble. She was precisely what this moment called for. Her assistant walked me directly to the corner office without a word. Audrey was at the floor-to-ceiling windows, her back to the room, looking down over the city below. She wore a tailored navy suit, her silver hair pulled back into a severe knot. No coffee was offered, no pleasantries exchanged. She simply turned and pointed to the chair across from her massive mahogany desk. "Sit down," she said. "Tell me who we're going after." I opened my briefcase and drew out the protective plastic folder with the final notice of default from the Vienna bank. I laid it across the polished wood toward her. I watched her perfectly manicured hands close around the document. Audrey was fluent in 4 languages, German among them. There was nothing to translate. I watched her eyes move across the bold red lettering at the top of the page. I caught the slight tightening along her jaw when she reached the 2nd paragraph. She set the paper down and drew a long, deliberate breath. "Betrug," she said, voicing the word. "Criminal fraud. A demand for over $400,000. Leonard, who on earth is Vivian marrying?" "His name is Dirk Braun," I said. "He presents himself as a prosperous technology entrepreneur running a thriving startup in Salzburg. He has been pushing hard for a rushed wedding with my daughter. They are set to marry in exactly 4 weeks. Audrey dropped the document onto the desk with an expression of open contempt. "There is no technology startup. Leonard, this letter is a final warning from the regulatory board. He is not an entrepreneur. He is a fugitive. He is sheltering in the United States because the moment he crosses back into Austria, they will put him in a cell." I leaned forward, elbows on her desk. "I know, Audrey. I sat across from him and his parents at a chop house 4 nights ago. They smiled at my face and spoke in German, convinced I was a helpless old fool. They called Vivian a stepping stone. They made jokes about using her for a visa. I need to stop this wedding, but I cannot simply walk in and hand Vivian this piece of paper. Dirk is a skilled manipulator. He has already framed me in her mind as a paranoid, xenophobic old man. If I present this without something bulletproof behind it, he will claim it is a forgery. He will say a business rival planted it. I need more than this. I need a mountain of evidence that no amount of charm can move. Audrey reclined in her leather chair, laced her fingers together, and fixed her gaze on the ceiling. Her mind was already a dozen moves ahead, mapping out the legal traps. "You're right," she said at last. "One document will not be enough to break through a trauma bond. Dirk has spent months constructing a false world around your daughter and cutting her off from the real one. We have to dismantle that world one layer at a time. We need his criminal records. We need the original loan applications he falsified. We need sworn statements from the people he defrauded across Europe. We need someone on the ground in Vienna tonight." She lifted her desk phone and dialed a long international number. I sat without moving, listening to the secure line reach across the Atlantic. Audrey was connecting with her most trusted contact in Europe. During our years working together in logistics, whenever a company tried to bury assets offshore, Audrey relied on a private investigator operating out of Vienna, a former intelligence officer whose specialty was prying open locked financial structures. "Guten Tag," she said when the call connected. "I need you on a target right now. His name is Dirk Braun. I am transmitting a bank routing number and a default notice as we speak. I want everything you can surface: bank statements, police records. I want to know where he sleeps, who he's in contact with, and the precise sum he stole." I could make out the low rumble of a German voice on the other end. The investigator asked something. "No," Audrey replied, her tone dropping to something close to absolute zero. "We don't have a month. You have 2 weeks. This man is attempting to marry the daughter of a very close friend of mine. I want you to dig so deep into Dirk Braun's life that you can tell me what he had for breakfast 5 years ago. Spare nothing. Bill it all to my firm." She replaced the receiver and turned back to me. "It's in motion," she said. "He will be moving through the Vienna court records and financial registries tonight. If Dirk left any kind of paper trail, we will have it. But, Leonard, there is a much more immediate problem on this side of the Atlantic." I looked at her. "What do you mean?" Audrey pressed a fingernail against the bank document. "Dirk is in the hole for nearly $500,000. He is forcing this timeline because his creditors are tightening their grip. But think about it. Why Vivian, your daughter, is accomplished, but she does not have $500,000 sitting liquid in a checking account, ready to be wired abroad." A cold knot settled deep in my gut. Audrey was right. Vivian earned well, but she was no millionaire. Dirk was a parasite who needed an immediate substantial payout. He would not invest this much effort, the isolation, the rush, the performance, unless he had already identified exactly where the money was. "How is he planning to get it, Audrey?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Audrey studied me with an expression of slow, terrible realization. "Leonard, think it through. What does Vivian have something that unlocks right around the time of this wedding? What pool of money has been sitting completely dormant, waiting for a specific legal event to release it?" The question hung between us in the quiet office, and its weight was suffocating. What asset does Vivian have that unlocks around the time of this wedding? The answer reached me like a freight train through a wall. Carolyn. It had always been about Carolyn. My late wife had spent her entire working life as a senior wealth manager at a major investment firm. She was exceptional with money and fiercely committed to protecting our family. When Carolyn received her terminal diagnosis 10 years ago, she did not spend that time grieving. She spent it planning. In her final months, she quietly liquidated her personal stock options and assembled a secure ironclad trust fund for Vivian. I had never touched a cent of it. It was Carolyn's last gift to our daughter, a guarantee that no matter what happened, Vivian would be safe. The account held exactly $500,000. Carolyn understood that sudden unearned wealth could damage a young person who wasn't ready for it. She built specific rigid triggers into the legal framework of that trust. She wanted Vivian to be settled and grounded before that kind of money became hers. The terms stipulated that the funds would transfer automatically to Vivian on her 32nd birthday or on the date of her legal marriage, whichever milestone arrived first. I had never given the marital clause a second thought because Vivian had always been so consumed by her architectural career. I never breathed a word of the trust fund to Dirk. Vivian must have told him herself in one of their late-night conversations. She probably brought it up as a tender memory of her mother, never for a moment imagining she was giving a starving predator the combination to a vault. I could pinpoint the exact moment it happened. A sunny afternoon in my backyard 2 months ago. Vivian was walking Dirk through the rose garden Carolyn had planted. I had been out on the porch with a newspaper pretending to read. I heard Vivian talking about how deeply she missed her mother. She told Dirk that Carolyn had left her a special financial gift set aside for her wedding day so she would always be looked after. Dirk had taken her hands in his, held her gaze, and played the devoted partner to perfection. I had no idea I was watching a thief study an unlocked vault from across a room. He absorbed that moment of grief and quietly began doing the arithmetic. I pushed up from my chair and moved to Audrey's wide window overlooking the city. The cold sweat on the back of my neck was already there. I stared down at the street below, running the numbers. Audrey rose and came to stand beside me. "Leonard," she said, her voice low and weighted with dread, "when exactly does Vivian turn 32? I swallowed. There was ash in my mouth. "November 18th, I said. Audrey went completely still. I turned to look at her, and the horror that had settled across her face was a mirror of my own. The wedding was scheduled for November 4th. Dirk had spent months engineering a rushed autumn ceremony, pressuring and pleading, wrapping himself in the costume of a devoted family man. He told Vivian his elderly grandparents in Vienna were in declining health and could only make the journey to America during a narrow 2-week window in November. He made her feel guilty. He made her feel as though postponing for a spring wedding meant breaking an old man's heart. Vivian, being the generous and empathetic woman she is, had eventually relented and moved the date forward. But it had nothing whatsoever to do with ailing grandparents in Austria. It was a calculated legal maneuver, executed with the cold precision of a corporate hostile takeover. The legal picture assembled itself in my mind with the precision of a chessboard. If Dirk simply waited until November 18th, the trust would trigger on its own the moment Vivian came of age. That $500,000 would belong to her as a personal premarital asset, completely beyond his reach in any divorce proceeding. But by forcing the ceremony to fall exactly 2 weeks before her birthday, he was deliberately rewriting the legal timeline. Under our state laws, the marriage itself would become the triggering event. That sudden $500,000 influx during the opening days of their union would be classified as joint marital property. He would have immediate legal claim to the funds, free to drain the account the very next morning and wire every cent directly to his creditors in Vienna to settle his massive fraud debts. Dirk didn't simply want to marry my daughter. He wanted to financially strip her clean. He was going to take her mother's dying gift, use it to keep himself out of a German prison, and then walk away. He would leave her bankrupt, heartbroken, and legally bound to a convicted international criminal. He had turned the memory of my dead wife into a weapon. The anger inside me changed shape. It was no longer the hot, blinding rage that had seized me on the sidewalk outside that chop house. It had become a cold, absolute certainty. I was a man who had spent 30 years dismantling corrupt suppliers, and Dirk Braun was nothing but a defective contract waiting to be canceled. I crossed back to Audrey's desk and looked down on the default notice from the Vienna bank. "Audrey," I said, my voice perfectly level, "he's going to need her signature to authorize the transfer once the trust unlocks." He couldn't simply seize the money on his own. Vivian would have to sign a release form acknowledging the joint account transfer. Audrey nodded, reaching for a blank legal pad. "You're right, Leonard. He'll try to dress it up as routine wedding paperwork, something dull and administrative, so she signs without ever reading the fine print." I closed my eyes and pulled up the previous Sunday in my mind. Dirk had shown up at Vivian's apartment, carrying a thick stack of documents. He claimed he needed her help with complicated immigration forms tied to his new visa. He had been relentless, almost desperate, urging her to just sign at the bottom so they could get back to planning the reception. I opened my eyes and met Audrey's gaze. My heart was hammering, but my thinking was sharp as glass. "He's already making his move," I told her. "I need to get hold of those documents today before she signs her life away." Audrey's investigator worked with the ruthless efficiency of a ghost moving through a digital machine. By Thursday morning, exactly 4 days after I'd sat across from Audrey's imposing mahogany desk, my phone rang. It was her private line. She skipped the pleasantries entirely. Just told me to get to her office immediately and to bring a physical hard drive. I drove downtown with a cold, heavy knot pulling tighter in my gut. The rain had cleared, leaving the city skyline hard and glaring against the winter sky. I walked into her corner office and found Audrey standing at the window, completely still, eyes fixed on the morning traffic below. Her desk was buried under thick manila folders. She turned, and for the first time in 30 years, Audrey Vance looked genuinely unsettled. "Leonard," she said, her voice stripped of its usual sharp authority, "you need to sit down. This is far worse than we thought." I took the chair across from her. My military training and corporate discipline stepped forward. I pushed the terrified father back and became the logistical auditor. "Show me," I said. Audrey opened the first folder and slid it across the desk. It was a dense stack of translated German legal documents. The investigator Rolf had torn Dirk's entire history in Vienna wide open. There was no technology startup. Audrey began tapping a manicured finger against a police report. Dirk Braun is not an entrepreneur. He's a mid-level accountant who worked for a regional logistics firm in Austria. Over 3 years, he systematically embezzled funds by constructing dummy shell corporations in Eastern Europe and funneling company money through them. He stole nearly $2 million before they caught him. I stared at the black and white text, German legal terms leaping off the page like warning sirens. Wire fraud, falsifying corporate records. He wasn't just a liar, he was a dedicated, methodical thief. Why isn't he sitting in a cell? I asked, my voice steady, despite the roaring in my ears. "Because he ran," Audrey replied flatly. "The logistics firm discovered the discrepancy 6 months ago and filed criminal charges, but the German prosecutors moved too slowly to freeze his assets. By the time the arrest warrant was issued, Dirk had already liquidated what he could and slipped into the United States on a tourist visa. He's been surviving on the last remnants of the stolen money, playing the wealthy European heir to impress Vivian." I leaned back, a sickening realization settling over me. That was why he was driving this wedding so aggressively. His tourist visa was expiring, and his stolen cash was nearly gone. He needed Vivian's trust fund to cover his immediate debts, and her signature on a marriage license to lock in a green card, shielding himself from deportation and German extradition. But it gets worse. Audrey continued opening a second, thinner folder. She pulled out a sheaf of financial records and bankruptcy filings. It isn't just Dirk. His parents Gerrit and Ilse are not the innocent, supportive European aristocrats they pretend to be. They are accomplices. She slid a translated German bankruptcy filing across the desk. Gerrit and Ilse had owned a small, failing manufacturing business outside of Vienna. When Dirk began embezzling, he funneled a significant share of the stolen money directly into his parents' sinking company to keep it breathing. They knew exactly where every euro was coming from. When investigators turned their attention to Dirk, the family business was immediately flagged and audited. They were now facing massive civil lawsuits from their own creditors. They had fled to America on the same pretext Dirk used, claiming an extended vacation. In reality, they were hiding out waiting for Dirk to secure Vivian's money so they could settle their own German debts and sidestep their own criminal exposure. I thought back to that night at the Chop House, Gerrit and Ilse laughing about Vivian being a naive stepping stone. They had been entirely complicit. They were a family of financial predators actively running the hunt together. They had looked at my brilliant, beautiful daughter and seen nothing but a massive walking bailout. Audrey paused, and the silence in the office became suffocating. She looked at me with an expression of deep, almost maternal pity. That look frightened me more than any of the bankruptcy filings. "Leonard," she said quietly, "brace yourself. Rolf found something else, something personal." She opened the third folder. Inside were printouts of translated text messages, emails, and a series of high-resolution photographs. I lifted the top photo. It showed Dirk standing in a Vienna beer garden, his arm pulled tight around a striking blonde woman. They were laughing, looking entirely at ease with each other. On her left hand sat a large, expensive-looking diamond ring. "Who is she?" I asked, the words catching in my throat. "Her name is Petra," Audrey replied, her voice quiet with a lethal kind of anger. "She is Dirk's fiancée, his real fiancée. They've been engaged for 2 years. I set the photo down on the desk. The image of Dirk holding another woman, making her promises about the future, while actively working to destroy my daughters, was almost too much to take in. Rolf accessed his secondary email accounts, Audrey explained. Dirk has been in contact with Petra nearly every single day since he arrived in the United States. He tells her he's here working on a massive corporate merger. He tells her he has to endure these tedious bureaucratic hurdles with American investors, but that he'll be back in Vienna soon with the capital they need to start their life together. She slid a translated email across to me. I read the words, and my blood went cold. Dirk had written explicitly to Petra, promising that once he secured the American investment, meaning Vivian's $500,000 trust fund, he would finalize the paperwork lock in his permanent residency and then gradually begin divorce proceedings. He planned to drain Vivian's accounts, pay off the German authorities to clear his name and file for a clean, uncontested divorce on grounds of irreconcilable differences. Once the smoke cleared, he intended to bring Petra to the United States on a spousal visa funded entirely by my dead wife's legacy. He never had any intention of staying with Vivian. He never meant to build a life with her. He was using my daughter as an ATM and a legal shield, planning to discard her the moment he had extracted every last cent. He was going to leave her emotionally shattered, financially destroyed, and legally entangled in an international embezzlement scandal. I sat in Audrey's office staring at the mountain of evidence spread across her desk. Before we go any further, I want you to sit with what is coming. What I was about to understand, the full calculated depth of what had been set in motion against my own daughter, would change everything about how I moved from that moment forward. Tell me something. If you discovered someone close to you had been quietly working against your family the whole time, would you confront them face to face or build your case in complete silence first? The initial shock had burned away, leaving behind a cold, calculating, and absolute fury. Dirk Braun had underestimated me. He had decided I was a gullible, uneducated mechanic. He had counted on his manufactured European charm and his fine suits to keep the monster beneath him invisible. He had played a dangerous, high-stakes game of deception, and he had made the fatal error of targeting the daughter of a man who spent 30 years dismantling corporate fraud on a global scale. Audrey watched me, her sharp eyes measuring my reaction. "We have enough to go to the authorities right now, Leonard," she said. "We can hand all of this to the FBI. They'll coordinate with the German prosecutors and have him arrested for wire fraud and visa violations before the week is out." I looked at the photograph of Dirk and his real fiancée. I thought about Vivian standing on that sidewalk outside the restaurant, in tears defending the very man who was engineering her ruin. If the FBI moved on him now, Dirk would spin it. He'd call from a holding cell, claiming it was all a massive misunderstanding, a corporate setup, a clerical error by the German banks. He'd cast himself as the victim, and Vivian, blinded by trauma and love, might actually believe him. She would spend years torturing herself over whether her father had destroyed her fairy tale. She would hate me for the rest of her life. "No," I said the word, landing in the quiet office with a terrifying, absolute finality. "The authorities will come in, but not yet. If we simply have him arrested, he becomes a martyr in Vivian's eyes. I need her to see exactly who he is. I need her to watch the monster pull off his own mask." Audrey leaned back in her chair, a slow, predatory smile moving across her face. "And just how do you intend to make that happen?" "Leonard, I'm going to hand him exactly what he wants," I replied, gathering the folders and setting them back in my briefcase. "I'm going to offer him money. I'm going to play the role of the desperate, defeated father who simply wants his daughter to be happy. I'll offer to personally fund his non-existent startup to keep Vivian's trust fund completely out of it. His arrogance and his greed will do the rest. He'll leap at the chance to take my money without having to wait on the wedding." Audrey's smile spread wider. "You're going to build a legal trap, a flawless one." "Exactly," I confirmed. "We're going to draft a contract that reads like an investment but functions like a confession. We'll bury clauses in the fine print requiring full international financial disclosure and surrendering any claim to Vivian's assets. He is far too arrogant to bring in an American attorney to review it, and his parents will push him to sign on the spot. The moment his signature hits that page, he will have legally confessed to perjury on his visa, application triggering an automatic federal red flag. And then," Audrey asked, her eyes bright with anticipation. "And then," I said, rising and buttoning my jacket, "I'm going to take him apart at the rehearsal dinner. I'm going to dismantle his fake empire in front of 50 guests in fluent German, using his own default notices and these photographs. I won't just stop the wedding. I will annihilate him completely." I called Dirk on a Thursday afternoon. I didn't text him. A text gives the other person time to study the tone, read between the lines, and consult with their accomplices. A phone call demands an immediate, unguarded reaction. When he picked up, his voice was soaked in that practiced, polished condescension I had grown to despise. I let my own voice tremble just slightly. I breathed in shallow, uneven pulls against the receiver, making myself sound utterly broken. I told him I needed to see him. I told him I couldn't take the silence from Vivian any longer, and that I was ready to surrender. I asked him to come to my home alone so we could speak man to man. Dirk agreed without hesitation. Predators never pass up the sight of a wounded animal crawling back toward them. I prepared my study with the precision of a military tactician seeding a minefield. I didn't want it to look like the workspace of a corporate director. I wanted it to feel like the retreat of a lonely, grieving widower. I drew the heavy velvet curtains to just the right angle, so the gray afternoon light threw long, weary shadows across the floor. I moved a framed photograph of Carolyn and Vivian to the very center of my mahogany desk, positioning it as the focal point of the room. I poured 2 glasses of bourbon, leaving them untouched on a silver tray. Then, I unfastened the top button of my shirt and let my shoulders deliberately cave, draining every trace of authority from my posture. I was no longer the man who dismantled global supply chain frauds. I was just a tired old father, frightened of dying alone. When Dirk arrived, he didn't knock. He pressed the doorbell once and walked straight in, moving through my front door with the casual ease of a man surveying his newly claimed territory. He came into my study wearing a tailored navy suit, looking entirely out of place against the quiet traditional room. He stood tall, chest forward, looking down at me where I sat behind the desk. He didn't offer his hand, he simply waited for me to speak, absorbing every drop of the authority he believed he held over me. I looked up at him, letting my eyes carry the full weight of the sleepless nights I'd endured. "Dirk," I began, my voice barely above a raw whisper, "I want to thank you for coming. I know I have no right to ask for your time after the way I behaved at the restaurant." Dirk smiled, a thin, humorless crease of his lips. He crossed the room to the leather armchair opposite my desk and settled into it, one leg draped over the other. "You really hurt Vivian," he said softly, using my daughter's pain as a blade within the first 10 seconds. "She has been crying every night, Leonard. She doesn't understand why her own father wants to destroy her happiness. My parents are deeply offended, though they are forgiving people. I am trying to be forgiving as well, but you have made it very difficult." I swallowed hard, forcing myself to absorb the humiliation without flinching. "You're right," I said, dropping my gaze to my hands. "I was wrong. I let grief and fear poison my thinking. Since Carolyn passed, Vivian has been my whole world. The idea of her marrying someone from so far away, of her moving on and leaving me behind, it drove me to a dark place. I heard your parents speaking German, and my mind constructed terrible things out of nothing, because I was desperately hunting for a reason to stop the wedding. I'm an old man, Dirk. I am set in my ways, and I was terrified." I watched his eyes. The tension drained from his shoulders in one smooth release. His ego was so vast, so relentlessly hungry for validation, that he swallowed the lie without a flicker of doubt. He leaned forward, lifted the glass of bourbon I had poured for him, and took a slow, appreciative sip. He believed he had broken me. He was certain his psychological campaign had shattered my resolve completely. "Leonard," he said, his voice settling into the patronizing register of a patient teacher correcting a slow student. "I understand your fear. It is natural for a father to feel that way, but you must trust me. I am going to give Vivian a beautiful life. We are going to build an empire together. My technology startup is on the verge of locking in major European contracts. Vivian is going to be the wife of a very successful man. You have absolutely nothing to worry about." I turned my eyes to the framed photograph of Carolyn. I let a long, heavy silence expand through the room, loading the emotional pressure until it was almost unbearable. "That's actually what I want to discuss with you," I said, letting my voice waver again. "Vivian told me about your business. She mentioned that she's planning to use her trust fund to help you secure the initial capital you need." Dirk went still. The glass of bourbon stopped in midair. His eyes cut to my face, scanning for a trap. He set the glass back carefully on the silver tray. "Vivian and I are partners," he said, smoothly sliding into his corporate register. "Marriage is about building a foundation together. The funds would be an investment in our shared future. It is a mere formality, really just a temporary injection of liquidity while my European investors finalize their paperwork." I nodded slowly, leaning forward and resting my elbows on the desk. "I know she loves you, Dirk, and I know she wants to stand behind you, but you have to understand what that money means to me. Carolyn built that trust fund while she was dying. She spent her final months tracking stocks and securing bonds just so she could sleep at night, knowing her little girl would always have a safety net. That money is the last living piece of her mother that Vivian has. The mere thought of it being thrown into a startup venture, even a brilliant one, tears me apart. I can't sleep. I can't breathe when I think about Carolyn's final gift being touched by anyone. I let a single tear form and track down my weathered cheek. It wasn't manufactured. I was crying for my wife, crying at the sheer evil sitting across from me, scheming to rob her of her legacy. Dirk watched that tear fall, and I caught the irritation flicker behind his eyes. He had no feeling whatsoever for Carolyn's memory. He only saw $500,000 slipping out of his reach. Leonard, I assure you the risk is virtually non-existent. He pressed edging forward in the chair. I have guaranteed returns. Vivian will see her investment double within the first fiscal year. You are letting your emotions override sound business logic. I know I am, I admitted, dragging the back of my hand across my face. I'm an emotional old fool, but I cannot allow her to use that specific money, Dirk. I simply cannot. Which is why I have a proposition for you, one that solves every problem in this room. Dirk's eyes narrowed. What kind of proposition? I pulled open the top drawer of my desk and withdrew a plain manila folder. I laid it gently on the polished wood and kept my hand resting flat on top of it. I have money, Dirk. Good money. 30 years, managing international supply chains. I saved, I invested. I live simply. I know you need $500,000 to clear the final hurdles for your startup. I want to give it to you. Dirk stopped breathing. The silence in the room became absolute. I watched his pupils dilate as the full weight of the offer crashed through his greedy mind. He had spent months working my daughter engineering, a rushed wedding, gambling on exposure from the German authorities, all to get his hands on $500,000. And now, the despised future father-in-law was simply sliding it across a desk. You want to invest in my company? He asked, his voice suddenly careful and tight. I don't want to invest, I corrected him, my tone soft and worn. I want to protect my daughter's trust fund. If you agree to leave Carolyn's money completely untouched, I will personally fund your startup. I will wire $500,000 directly to your business accounts next week. You get the capital you need immediately, no waiting on a marriage certificate, no dealing with Vivian's bank. And I get to sleep at night knowing my wife's legacy is sitting safe in a protected account. I watched an internal war play out on his face. The caution of a career criminal going head-to-head against the raw, overwhelming force of absolute greed. He was running the angles. If he took my money, he wouldn't have to wait for the marriage license to clear any legal barriers. He could settle with the Vienna bank before the deadline hit. He could rescue his parents from bankruptcy. And he could still marry Vivian to lock in his American visa. In his mind, this was the ultimate score. He wasn't taking the money, I was handing it over voluntarily like a fool. There is always a catch, Leonard, Dirk said, working to hold on to his polished facade. But the hunger burning in his eyes gave him away entirely. What are your conditions? Just one, I answered, releasing a long, exhausted breath. I'm an old man, Dirk, and I'm old-fashioned. I don't do business on a handshake. If I am handing you $500,000 of my life savings, we do it the proper way. A standard corporate investment contract. My lawyer will draft it. It will simply document the transfer and include a standard clause confirming that this money removes any need to touch Vivian's trust fund. Just for my peace of mind, I need a piece of paper proving I protected my little girl. Dirk settled back into the leather chair, a slow, triumphant smile spreading across his face. He was no longer looking at me as a father, he was looking at me as a broken, pathetic bank. He took my insistence on a legal contract as nothing more than the paranoid grasping of a defeated man desperate to feel relevant. He had no idea that my lawyer was Audrey Vance. He had no idea that the contract we were preparing would carry a financial disclosure clause buried so deep in the legal language that signing it would amount to a federal confession. He was far too arrogant to believe an old mechanic could draft a snare he couldn't see. Leonard, Dirk said, his voice thick with magnanimous victory, I think that is an entirely reasonable request. You are a good father. You are simply trying to shield your daughter, and I respect that deeply. I will gladly sign your paperwork. We can keep this strictly between us. Vivian doesn't need to know about the financial particulars. She only needs to know that we have made peace. Thank you, Dirk, I whispered, letting my shoulders fall even further, as though a crushing burden had just been lifted. You don't know what this means to me. I'll have my lawyer send the documents to your apartment by Monday. Dirk rose and buttoned his tailored jacket. He surveyed my quiet, dimly lit study one final time, silently declaring himself the master of my home. Then he extended his hand across the desk. I reached out and shook it. His grip was firm and arrogant. Mine was steady and cold. "I will see you at the rehearsal dinner," Leonard Dirk said, turning toward the door. "We are going to be a wonderful family." I sat in the silence of my study long after I heard his car back out of my driveway. The scent of his expensive European cologne still hung in the air, a foul trace of the predator who had just stood in my sanctuary. I looked at the framed photograph of Carolyn. I had promised her I would keep our daughter safe, and I was about to deliver on that promise with brutal, uncompromising finality. I picked up my phone and dialed Audrey's private number. She answered on the first ring. "Did he take the bait?" she asked, her voice charged with anticipation. "He swallowed the hook, the line, and the sinker," I replied, emptying both glasses of bourbon down the small drain in the corner bar. "Draft the contract, bury the perjury confession, and the marital asset waiver deep inside the standard clauses. He is so blinded by the money that he'll sign his own death warrant by Monday morning." The trap was set. The Trojan horse had been walked directly into the center of his fabricated empire. Dirk believed he was leaving with $500,000. He had no idea he was strolling straight toward his own public execution. The moment Dirk Braun's luxury rental car vanished down my street, I walked to the kitchen and poured the remaining coffee down the drain. The exhaustion was gone. In its place came the cold, hyper-focused energy I always felt before a major supply chain takedown. I knew Dirk was greedy, but I needed to see exactly how that greed was moving in real time. In 30 years of corporate logistics, I learned that you never simply spring a trap and walk away. You watch the target as he steps into it. My phone buzzed on the counter. It was Audrey. No greeting, she just told me to check my secure emails immediately. Her investigator in Vienna had cloned Dirk's phone data 2 days earlier. We had been capturing his text messages and intercepting his calls. Audrey told me that Dirk had dialed his parents the instant his engine turned over in my driveway. She had attached the audio file to the email. I opened my laptop on the kitchen island and hit play. The recording was crisp. I can hear the hum of Dirk's car engine and the steady rhythm of his windshield wipers. The line rang twice before his father picked up. Garrett spoke in German, his voice taut and impatient, demanding to know whether the American father had caused any further trouble. Dirk answered with a loud, triumphant laugh that filled the small speakers of my computer. He sounded euphoric like a gambler who had just cleaned out the house. He told his father to sit down and put the phone on speaker so his mother could hear. I listened as Ilse's sharp, aristocratic voice joined the call, asking what was happening. Dirk didn't waste a second. He told them I had surrendered. He sketched out a contemptible picture of me, weeping behind my desk over my dead wife, so terrified of losing Vivian, and so completely hollowed out by grief that I had offered to buy his goodwill. With unmistakable pride, Dirk announced to his parents that the dim-witted old mechanic had volunteered to surrender $500,000 in total, all so Vivian's trust fund would remain completely off limits. What followed on the recording was a stunned, heavy silence. Several seconds went by where neither Garrett nor Ilse could form a word. The sheer size of the figure had knocked the air out of them, just as it had frozen Dirk solid inside my study. Then Ilse's voice cracked through it, a sharp, breathless burst of laughter. She had a name for me, a weak, pathetic old fool. Americans, she said, were so consumed by the need to feel significant that they'd gladly torch their entire life savings just to strut around as the family protector. The woman was practically trembling with glee. Garrett, though, held back just a fraction. He pressed his son on the catch. A man doesn't part with $500,000 out of sentiment. There had to be a string attached somewhere. Dirk swatted the concern away without a moment's thought. No catch, he insisted. I just wanted a piece of paper, a standard business contract to make myself feel like a big corporate player. He laughed at my insistence on paperwork, painting it as the futile hand-wringing of a sad television-addled old widower. He laid it out simply for them. A local lawyer would draw up a basic investment document, and all Dirk had to do was show up and write his name. I sat listening to Garrett's slow, deliberate breathing on the line. The man was doing the math. The Vienna bank was demanding repayment of over $400,000. A wire of $500,000 American would absorb the exchange loss, wipe the fraudulent debt clean, and still leave a workable buffer to cover day-to-day expenses while they hid out on this side of the Atlantic. For a family drowning in debt, it was a rope thrown from shore. Something shifted in Garrett's voice then. the wariness dissolved, burned away by a naked, urgent greed. He told Dirk flatly this was their rescue. The German authorities weren't backing off, the pressure kept mounting, and here was a clean pile of cash that bore no fingerprints connecting it to their European mess. Vivian wouldn't have to field any awkward questions from her bank. There was no marriage certificate to wait on, no local court backlog to navigate. Garrett didn't suggest, he commanded, "Get it done. Sign whatever the old man puts in front of you, because once that transfer goes through, nobody can touch them." Ilsa piled on without hesitation. "Take the money, keep the family out of prison, and go ahead and marry Vivian regardless. After the wedding, they'd find ways to steer her toward the trust fund over time. The way she calculated it, they'd pocket my savings by the end of the week and circle back for my daughter's inheritance soon after. They genuinely believed they had won, that my family was theirs for the taking." I killed the audio and set the laptop aside. My hands didn't so much as tremble. These people had caught the scent of easy money, and that hunger had made them stone blind to everything circling below the surface. It never entered their thinking to wonder why a man who spent his career fixing engines would hand over $500,000 with such composure. The idea that the target had been running his own operation all along never crossed their minds once. I dialed Audrey. She picked up before the second ring. "I'm guessing the audio was educational," she said, a quiet, dangerous satisfaction threading through her voice. "Every syllable," I told her. "They're not cautious anymore. Audrey, they're famished. That money is going to pull them straight into the wire. Where do we stand on the contract?" She had been at it all day. What she described next landed with the quiet, methodical confidence of someone who had done this before. On its face, the document read, as a private equity investment in Dirk's supposed technology venture. Pages 1 and 2 were dense with the kind of unremarkable financial boilerplate that makes eyes glaze over the mechanics of a 500 to 1,000 transfer dressed up in corporate dressing. The whole point was to lull him into comfort, make it feel like the sort of thing he might have assembled himself back in Austria. Page 3 was something else entirely. Buried inside it was a comprehensive international financial disclosure clause. The act of signing obligated Dirk to certify under penalty of perjury under United States law that he carried zero unresolved criminal liabilities, held no foreign liens, and faced no active fraud proceedings in any overseas jurisdiction. An international transfer of that magnitude brought the clause directly under federal banking statutes. The moment his pen touches that line, Audrey said, measured and deliberate, he has committed a federal offense on American soil. A lie on a legally binding financial instrument. And Leonard the Mine didn't stop there. She had sewn in a marital asset waiver as well. I asked her to walk me through the mechanics. In plain terms, by accepting the $500,000 investment, Dirk was formally relinquishing every future legal claim to Vivian's premarital holdings. Her trust fund, any life insurance disbursements, any inheritance. The drafting left no gaps. Even if the wedding went forward, Carolyn's money would be sealed off from him permanently. "He won't make it to page 3. I told Audrey, no doubt in my voice whatsoever. "He figures my attorney is some strip mall real estate lawyer working off downloaded templates. His parents are going to be screaming at him to grab the cash, so he'll flip straight to the signature block and get it done." Audrey saw it the same way. A private courier would carry the sealed contract to Dirk's luxury rental on Monday morning. Her advice for the weekend: go dark, stay still, give him room to stew. The weekend stretched out like taffy. On Saturday, I worked through the rose garden, trimming and shaping the bushes Carolyn had put in the ground years before. My thoughts kept drifting to Vivian. No call came from her. She was deep in the details, menus, flowers, table arrangements, assembling her dream day with no idea that the world she was building it on was about to give way. The ache of missing her was constant. Every instinct told me to drive to her place and drag her clear of the whole thing. I overruled every instinct. Discipline was the only currency that mattered now. Monday broke cold and quiet. I positioned myself in my study with a clear view of the wall clock as it moved past 9. The courier's delivery window opened at exactly 9:15 at Dirk's building. At 9:30, my phone lit up an email from Audrey's subject line containing a single word: delivered. I sat there in the stillness and let myself see it. Dirk tearing back the flap on a thick envelope, eyes snagging on that bold dollar figure at the top of page 1. He wouldn't phone an attorney. Any serious corporate lawyer would pull at his Austrian financials to vet the startup, and that kind of scrutiny would end him. His ego was his only counsel. He had nothing else to lean on. At 10:15:45 minutes to the tick after the envelope changed hands, my phone rang. Audrey, I answered and let her speak first. "The scanned copy just hit my inbox," she said, and the victory in her voice was unmistakable. "He signed every page, Leonard. Initialed the disclosure clause. Initialed the marital waiver. No questions, no pushback. He countersigned his own destruction and then asked for a wire date." I shut my eyes and breathed out slowly all the way down. The mechanism had closed. Dirk Braun was legally ensnared, his exposure, now a matter of record, and he had no idea. He walked out of my house, certain he'd played a broken old man perfectly. He was sure he'd bought himself freedom and a fortune at once. "Tell him the money clears Friday morning," I said to Audrey. "Tell him transfers at this scale trigger a mandatory bank holding period." 4 days. That was what we had. Friday was the rehearsal dinner. Friday was when I would stand before 50 people, Garrett, Ilse Vivian, her closest friends, and every one of them would hear what this man truly was. Friday was when the bumbling old father was scripted to raise a glass and wish the couple well. I thanked Audrey, set the phone down, and slid open my desk drawer. Out came the German default notices, the photographs of Dirk's actual fiancée, Petra, and the translated police reports. I squared them into a neat stack inside a dark leather folder. Greed had done exactly what I needed it to do. Dirk Braun never hesitated, never questioned, never looked twice. Now came the part where I pulled the line taut and finished it. Audrey and I had put real hours into engineering that document together. Seated in her glass-walled conference room, over cups of coffee gone cold, she had built out the full legal scaffolding of Dirk Braun's undoing. My direction for the opening pages had been clear: make them feel like an opportunity rich with the kind of aspirational language that venture capital people love. Audrey was a master of her craft. She knew exactly which terms made amateur businessmen feel like titans. But that third page was an entirely different animal, a labyrinth of lethal legal consequences concealed behind unremarkable language. Audrey had tucked the International Financial Disclosure Clause inside a dense block of text about standard banking compliance. The substance of it was simple and devastating. By accepting the $500,000 Dirk was swearing under penalty of perjury that no criminal or civil financial investigation of any kind was active against him in any international jurisdiction. It locked him into federal wire fraud statutes. If he put his name on that line while actively running from an embezzlement charge in Vienna, he was committing a federal offense on American soil. The second clause was the one I had insisted on, above everything else, the marital asset waiver. Audrey had dressed it up to look like a routine non-compete and conflict of interest protocol. Buried beneath the dense legal vocabulary was language that permanently severed Dirk from any claim to Vivian's premarital holdings, including her mother's trust fund, regardless of when the ceremony took place. The moment he signed, he would be legally barring himself from the vault he had spent months engineering a way into. I had one additional condition: the final signature had to happen in person. I told Dirk that my attorney required a physically notarized copy before $500,000 could move. He agreed without a beat of hesitation. He walked into Audrey's downtown office on a crisp Wednesday morning, carrying himself like a man who had just claimed a kingdom. He wore a tailored charcoal suit and a silk tie radiating the kind of unearned confidence that turns the stomach. He came alone. No lawyer, no advisor. His ego was so outsized that he genuinely regarded an American corporate attorney as nothing more than a glorified accountant managing someone's retirement portfolio. Audrey played her role without a crack. She didn't announce herself as a senior partner. She poured him a glass of sparkling water, offered him a sleek silver pen, and carried herself like a simple facilitator moving paperwork along. Dirk settled into the chair at the massive mahogany table and turned on the charm immediately. He complimented Audrey's office completely, failing to register that the woman handing him the pen had spent decades dismantling multinational corporations. I sat across from him in the role of the worn-out, anxious father. Before the folder was even opened, I asked him whether he'd like his own legal counsel to look over the terms first. I offered to hold the transfer until his people in Austria could review everything. It was the final test. A real lawyer would have cracked the trap open in minutes, but Dirk just laughed, brushing the suggestion aside with a wave of his hand. His European legal team, he explained, was occupied with his global patents and couldn't be troubled by what amounted to a family loan. He leaned back and looked at me with a thick, suffocating smugness, treating my insistence on paperwork as the anxious fussing of a man who needed to feel useful. He flipped open the leather folder. He gave a document controlling $500,000 exactly 45 seconds of his attention. His eyes moved across the first page, landing on the bold figures detailing the payout, and then moved on. He skipped the dense paragraphs on page 2 entirely. When he reached page 3, the page carrying the federal perjury trap and the marital waiver, his gaze slid right over the legal text without absorbing a word. He located the dotted line, and that was all he needed. Dirk uncapped the silver pen, leaned in, and signed his name with a large theatrical flourish. He initialed the bottom of every single page, binding himself to every consequence Audrey had so carefully engineered. He slid the folder back across the table toward me, and as he released it, a quiet breath left him the exhale of a man who believes he has just won. Certain no one else in the room spoke his language, he let a smirk settle on his face. He murmured a crude Austrian insult under his breath, something about a pathetic old dog surrendering his bones. He was convinced he had just walked away with my life savings. He was certain the game was over, and he had taken everything. I didn't drop his gaze for a second. I looked straight into the arrogant eyes of the man who had set out to destroy my daughter. Then I closed the leather folder, slowly resting both hands flat on the smooth surface. I smiled at him, wide, unhurried, and absolutely genuine, because the trap had just snapped shut. The rehearsal dinner was held in the private dining room of a historic downtown hotel. Crystal chandeliers bathed the space in warm amber light, throwing long, elegant shadows across the white-draped tables. 50 guests were seated, enjoying prime rib and expensive champagne. It was the eve of the wedding, the last night of Dirk Braun's elaborate illusion. Dirk occupied the head of the main table, like a man who had conquered a small country. He wore a tailored silk dinner jacket and held court the entire evening, spinning inflated stories for Vivian's friends about his phantom technology empire in Salzburg, laughing at his own punchlines and gesturing broadly with a glass of imported wine. Beside him, Garrett and Ilse were entirely in their element. They clinked their glasses, beamed at the American guests, and performed the role of old-world nobility with practiced ease. The waiters in pressed black aprons received only the barest acknowledgement, a dismissive flick of the wrist when water was poured. From time to time, the two of them would lean together and trade quick hush phrases in their native German. They praised the food while quietly mocking the venue. I sat at the far end of the table, eating slowly and catching every word. Garrett muttered that American architecture had no history and no elegance. Ilse laughed softly and observed that at least American bank accounts were very easy to open. They glanced my way occasionally, raising their glasses in a pantomime of respect. In their minds, I was simply a beaten old man who had bought himself a seat at their table by handing over his savings. They were certain the signed contract sitting in Audrey's office was the trophy of their victory. The thought that it was actually their indictment had never entered their heads. Vivian was radiant. She wore a simple, elegant white silk dress, and her face carried the luminous joy of a woman watching her life fall exactly into place. She moved between tables all evening, embracing friends and laughing with her bridesmaids, assembling her fairy tale moment by moment, with no awareness whatsoever that the foundation beneath it was made of quicksand. I watched her pull her best friend into a hug and felt the ache land hard behind my ribs. She was giving everything, her whole heart and her whole future, to a man who had priced her out to the nearest euro. When dessert arrived, the waiters circled the room, refilling champagne flutes. Vivian rose from her chair and tapped a silver spoon gently against her crystal glass. The chiming tone moved through the dining room, and all 50 guests turned toward her. She looked at Dirk with a trust so open and unguarded, it broke something in me. She spoke about love as a leap of faith, a bridge thrown between two different worlds. She thanked Garrett and Ilse for crossing an ocean to make her feel part of their family. She thanked them for raising a man of such character and warmth. Then she turned to Dirk. She thanked him for showing her what it looked like to build something on a foundation of complete honesty and mutual respect. She told the room he had taught her that real partnership meant keeping nothing hidden. She painted a future of blended cultures and shared ambitions, every sentence a portrait of the love she believed was real. Each word was a testament to who she was, and each word landed on me like a blow, because the man sitting beside her was drinking it all in like a parasite feeding on a host. He gazed up at her adoringly, reaching out to close his hand over hers. To the room, he was the devoted partner. In reality, he was cataloging the applause nourishing his ego on the goodwill of the very people he was planning to defraud. When Vivian finished and sat down to warm applause, Dirk kissed her hand and settled his arm behind her chair. The performance was seamless. Then the best man, a college friend of Vivian's, leaned toward the microphone and announced it was time for the father of the bride to say a few words. The room responded with a round of generous, welcoming applause. I rose slowly, deliberately taking my time to fasten the button on my jacket. I wasn't holding a champagne flute. I hadn't scrawled anything on a note card. What I carried was a dark leather folder containing the translated German embezzlement warrants, the photographs of Dirk's real fiancée Petra in Vienna, and the accurate translation of the power of attorney document he had maneuvered Vivian toward signing. The folder felt substantial in my grip. It felt like a loaded weapon. The room settled into a warm, expectant quiet. Vivian looked up at me and offered the most open, hopeful smile I had ever seen on her face. She assumed I was going to deliver a sentimental speech about letting my little girl go. She figured I was about to formally welcome Dirk into our family and bestow my blessing on them both. Dirk leaned back in his chair, arms folded across his chest, a faint patronizing smirk playing at his lips. He regarded me with the eyes of a predator who had already swallowed his prey whole. He was braced for my public surrender. He was waiting for the oblivious old mechanic to choke down his pride and sue for peace. I rose slowly from my seat and walked to the head of the table, positioning myself directly across from Dirk. The ambient sounds of the hotel, the soft clink of silverware, the low murmur of conversation, the muted jazz drifting through the room seemed to dissolve entirely. What remained was the steady measured rhythm of my own heartbeat. I looked out at 50 faces staring back at me, each one expecting something warm and sentimental. I looked at my daughter. I let the full crushing weight of my love for her settle over me. I knew that what I was about to do would break her heart this evening, but it would save her life the morning after. I told Vivian that her mother and I had always made a promise to protect her. I told her that Carolyn had spent her final days on this earth making certain that her daughter would always have a safety net, a shield against the worst this world could offer. I told her that real love does not operate in the shadows, and it certainly does not ask you to surrender your legacy as proof of your devotion. Vivian's smile flickered, slightly thrown by the grave, serious weight of my words. She shifted in her seat, her gaze moving between me and Dirk. I pulled my eyes away from my daughter and fixed them on the man sitting next to her. The smirk on Dirk's face began to slip just a fraction as he registered the cold, flat expression looking back at him. He had been expecting a broken man offering a tearful concession. He had not anticipated the icy, unwavering gaze of someone who was about to begin a total and systematic dismantling of everything he had built. I set the dark leather folder flat on the white linen tablecloth. I did not raise my voice. I did not shout or gesture wildly. I let the profound, pressing silence of the room do the work for me. The trap had been sprung, the exits had been sealed, and there was nowhere left on earth for him to go. I rested both hands on the leather cover and drew a long, steady breath, ready to take apart his entire existence, piece by piece. "How exactly are you going to stop me?" Dirk asked. I glanced down at the dark leather folder lying on the white linen tablecloth. The whole room had sunk into a deep, anticipatory hush, still waiting for the customary speech from a proud father. The waiters stood motionless against the walls, trays of champagne balanced in their hands. I slid the folder quietly across the table until it came to rest directly in front of my daughter. Vivian looked at the dark leather cover, then lifted her eyes to mine with a puzzled, tentative smile. "Open it, Vivian," I said, my voice low, but carrying a gravity that made the guests around her hold their breath. I told her that before she pledged her life and her mother's legacy to this man, she needed to see his actual record. Vivian reached out with trembling fingers and lifted the cover. The first thing her eyes landed on was the translated police warrant issued by the Austrian authorities. Bold black letters, spelling out wire fraud and embezzlement, stared up at her. I watched her brow crease as she worked to make sense of the stark legal language. Then she turned to the next page. It was a high-resolution photograph of Dirk, standing in a Vienna beer garden with Petra pressed close against his chest. The large diamond ring on the German woman's finger caught the full flash of the camera. I saw the precise moment my daughter's heart came apart. Her breath snagged in her throat, and a quiet gasp slipped from her lips. She looked at Dirk, who had gone suddenly pale and rigid in his silk jacket. Vivian turned to the third document. It was a certified English translation of the immigration form he had pressured her into signing the week before. I told her it was not a visa application. I explained that it was a blanket power of attorney crafted specifically to drain her trust fund the instant they exchanged vows. Dirk shoved back from his chair and launched to his feet. He drove both hands down onto the table, sending the crystal champagne flutes shuddering and spilling across the white linen. "These are lies!" he shouted in English, his voice ricocheting off the high ceilings of the private dining room. He jabbed a trembling finger in my direction and told the 50 guests that I was a bitter, paranoid old man who had paid criminals to forge documents. He scanned the room frantic for sympathy from Vivian's friends. He claimed I was trying to frame him because I resented his European background and could not stomach the idea of my daughter leaving my house. He turned to Vivian and dropped to his knees, begging her not to read the papers, swearing on his own life that it was all a jealous setup, arranged by a lonely widower. Garrett and Ilse began speaking rapidly in English, rushing to defend their son. Ilse insisted she had never seen the woman in the photograph. Garrett loudly demanded that the hotel management summon the police and have me removed for disrupting a private event. They believed they could shout me into submission, just as they had believed they could use my family for their own rescue. I did not raise my voice to meet their panic. I simply reached into the folder and lifted out the original bank default notice. I looked squarely at Garrett and Ilse, who were by then practically screaming at the waiters. Then I locked eyes with Dirk. I began to read the document aloud, not in English, but in flawless, unaccented Austrian German. I read out the exact date of his financial default. I read the specific article of the German penal code he had violated. I pronounced the word for fraud with a sharp, cutting precision that made his mother let out a small, terrified whimper and sink into her chair. Dirk stood frozen. His mouth fell open, but nothing came out. The color drained completely from his face, leaving him hollow and emptied out. He understood in that agonizing, humiliating instant that the clueless American father-in-law had caught every insult, every vicious joke, and every cruel scheme they had spoken aloud at the chop house. He realized I had known everything from the very start. I switched back to English for the benefit of the stunned room. I told him he was a coward and a thief who had fled a collapsing shell corporation in Vienna. I informed the guests that his parents were hiding from civil lawsuits and bankruptcy, counting on my daughter's money to cover their enormous debts. I pointed to the photograph of his real fiancée and told Vivian that he had intended to abandon her and bring Petra to America on Carolyn's money. Dirk tried to pull himself together. He scrambled upright, adjusting his silk jacket with shaking hands. He sputtered that I had no proof, that I was just a retired mechanic hurling wild accusations. He puffed out his chest and declared himself a wealthy investor. He shouted that the contract I had signed on Wednesday proved we were business partners and that I was legally bound to hand over $500,000. He told the room I was obligated to finance his technology startup and that my own signature confirmed the arrangement. That was when the heavy walnut doors at the back of the dining room swung open. Audrey Vance walked in, wearing a pristine navy suit and carrying a slim silver briefcase. The crisp, rhythmic click of her heels pulled the absolute attention of every person in the room. She moved straight to the head of the table, bypassing the rattled waiters and bewildered guests. She introduced herself as senior corporate counsel. She regarded Dirk with the cold detachment of an exterminator sizing up a pest. She informed him that the investment contract he had signed so eagerly was not a standard loan agreement. She laid out for the silent room that Clause 7 required a sworn certification under federal banking law, that he was not under any active international criminal investigation. She told him that by signing his name while actively fleeing a Vienna embezzlement charge, he had committed federal perjury on American soil. Dirk began to sweat visibly. He gripped the edge of the table, fighting to keep his legs from giving out beneath him. Audrey did not stop. She informed him that because the perjury was tied to a massive international wire transfer, her firm was legally required to report the fraud to the federal authorities. She offered a sharp, terrifying smile and told him his tourist visa had been flagged for immediate revocation. She explained that he was no longer an immigrant awaiting a wedding. He was a federal suspect waiting for deportation, and he had waived his rights to her assets by signing that contract. Dirk stammered, his arrogance stripped away, entirely replaced by blind, unraveling panic. "I waived my rights to her assets. The money you promised me is clean. I did exactly what you asked me to do." Audrey opened her silver briefcase and drew out a single sheet of paper. She laid it on the table beside the leather folder. She told him that the marital waiver was indeed legally binding, protecting Vivian's trust fund in perpetuity. However, she explained that the funding clause required a mandatory waiting period for international background checks. She told him that $0 had been transferred to his accounts. She looked him dead in the eyes and stated that he had signed away his rights to Vivian's money, confessed to a federal crime, and secured his own deportation for absolutely nothing. Garrett and Ilse sat in complete silence, the full weight of that reality settling over them. Their lifeline was permanently severed. Their elaborate scheme to plunder an American fortune had crumbled into dust. They stared at their son with a mixture of terror and blame, knowing that their financial ruin back in Germany was now impossible to avoid. Vivian pushed her chair back and got to her feet, leaving the folder untouched on the table. She looked at the man she had nearly married with pure, unfiltered disgust. Dirk reached toward her, begging her to listen, begging her to help him salvage the situation. He tried to take her hand, but Vivian stepped back, wiping a single tear from her cheek. She did not raise her voice. She simply told him she never wanted to see his face again, that he was nothing but a parasite. I stepped in beside my daughter and placed a steady hand on her shoulder. The room held its breath, the only sound, the soft exhales of the stunned guests. The monster had been hauled into the light, and every piece of his fabricated empire had been reduced to ash. I had protected my child, and I had made certain that the predators who came for her would spend the rest of their lives settling that debt. I stood there beside her, hand resting on her shoulder. As the shockwave of the revelation rolled through the dining room, Dirk was clutching the edges of the white linen tablecloth with both hands, Knuckles' white chest heaving with panicked, uneven breaths, his counterfeit empire vaporized in an instant. Garrett and Ilse, who had spent the entire evening performing like European royalty, were now shrinking into their chairs. The arrogant sneers had vanished, replaced by the hollow, frantic faces of cornered animals. Ilse was weeping silently, both hands pressed to her face, the crushing reality of their massive German debts and the criminal charges bearing down on her all at once. Garrett looked at his son with undisguised absolute hatred. In the span of a few minutes, Dirk had not only failed to secure their financial rescue, he had exposed their complicity to federal authorities as well. Audrey Vance, standing at the head of the table like an executioner in a Navy suit, did not offer them a single shred of mercy. She calmly set her silver briefcase on the table and snapped the locks shut. The sound was as crisp and final as a judge's gavel. She informed Dirk that building security had already been notified. She advised him in a tone stripped of all emotion to collect his parents and vacate the premises immediately before hotel management decided to involve the local police for disturbing a private event. Dirk looked up at Vivian, eyes wide and pleading. He made one last pathetic reach for manipulation. "Darling, please," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I can explain everything. We can fix this. I love you." Vivian did not yell. She did not hurl her champagne glass or make a scene. She looked down at him with an expression of profound, absolute disgust. It was the look you give something repellent before you scrape it off the bottom of your shoe. "Get out of my sight, Dirk," she said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous calm. "If you ever contact me again, my father's lawyer will see to it that you're buried under federal charges. Get out." Dirk opened his mouth, but one glance at Audrey's eyes silenced him completely. He understood that every word out of his mouth could and would be folded into a federal indictment. He backed slowly away from the table, his movements stiff and uncoordinated. He snatched his silk dinner jacket from the back of his chair, looking every inch the broken fraud he was. Garrett stood up, grabbed Ilse's arm, and all but dragged her from her seat. They did not look at me. They did not look at Vivian. They kept their heads down, eyes fixed to the floor, as they scurried toward the heavy walnut doors at the back of the dining room. Dirk followed, shoulders caved inward, the arrogant swagger gone without a trace. All 50 guests watched them go in stunned, motionless silence. As Dirk reached the doors, he turned back one final time, fixing me with a look of mingled terror and total defeat. He understood the gravity of what he had walked into. He had tried to con a man who had spent 30 years grinding corrupt suppliers into the dirt on a global scale. I did not blink. I simply watched him walk out that door, knowing full well he was stepping directly into a federal nightmare. The instant the heavy doors clicked shut behind them, the tension broke open. Vivian turned to me and buried her face against my shoulder, finally letting the tears come. I pulled her close and held on, feeling that old fierce surge of protective love wash over me. I murmured into her hair that she was safe, that the trust fund was untouched, and that Carolyn's legacy remained completely intact. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of legal and emotional fallout. Audrey's trap had operated without a flaw. By signing the investment contract, Dirk had legally confessed to perjury regarding his immigration status. Audrey's firm forwarded the signed document, along with the translated Vienna police reports, directly to the federal authorities. Dirk's tourist visa was flagged for immediate revocation within 48 hours. He tried to retain a cut-rate immigration lawyer, but the moment that attorney laid eyes on the federal perjury confession and the international embezzlement warrants, he dropped Dirk as a client without hesitation. The authorities did not waste any time. Dirk was detained by federal agents at his luxury rental apartment, handcuffed and taken into custody for visa fraud. He was not given the opportunity to contest the charges in an American court. Audrey's investigator had already alerted the German authorities, who issued an immediate extradition request. Dirk Braun was deported back to Vienna in under 3 weeks. He stepped off that plane not as a wealthy technology investor, but as a disgraced fugitive arriving in handcuffs to face his embezzlement charges. Garrett and Ilse suffered a parallel fate. Without Vivian's $500,000 trust fund to bail them out, their failing manufacturing business collapsed entirely. Their creditors moved in on their assets, their properties were liquidated, and they were left to face the civil lawsuits they had crossed an ocean to escape. They lost everything. Their greed and arrogance had stripped them down to nothing. The weeks following the disaster at the rehearsal dinner moved with a slow, heavy rhythm. The wedding invitations that had been sent out so carefully to friends and family were followed in short order by quiet, polite phone calls canceling the whole event. Vivian moved her belongings back into her childhood bedroom, while she worked through the complicated, exhausting task of unwinding her life from the man who had tried to destroy it. She spent the first several days crying behind a closed door, grieving the future she had genuinely believed was hers. I did not push her to talk. I did not knock to offer unsolicited advice or a father's lecture. I simply made certain there was always fresh coffee in the kitchen and something warm sitting on the stove. I knew she needed time to mourn the beautiful illusion before she could begin to process the terrifying truth underneath it. When Vivian finally came out of her room at the end of the week, she looked worn to the bone, but the deep, blinding fog of manipulation had lifted completely from her eyes. We spent an entire Saturday afternoon together, boxing up the wedding decorations, the seating charts, and the glossy bridal magazines. As she folded her unworn white silk dress and placed it carefully into a heavy protective box, she finally broke her silence. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a deep, crushing gratitude. She told me she had gone to the bank earlier that week to check on the exact status of her mother's trust fund. The bank manager had walked her through the marital property laws in our state, confirming every single detail that Audrey and I had uncovered during our investigation. Vivian told me she understood now exactly how close she had come to losing the one thing her mother had worked so hard to leave her. She realized she had been standing at the edge of a financial cliff, completely blindfolded by love, and that I had pulled her back just seconds before she was shoved into the abyss. She sat on the living room floor, surrounded by brown cardboard boxes, and cried hard. These were not tears of heartbreak over losing Dirk to another woman or a collapsed relationship. They were tears of sheer terror at the bullet she had just barely dodged. She apologized to me again and again for doubting me outside the chop house, for taking his side, when he lied so effortlessly, for letting him wedge himself between us during those last few months. I lowered myself to the carpet beside her and pulled her close exactly the way I had when she was a small girl who had scraped her knee on the driveway. I did not gloat over what had been accomplished. I did not say "I told you so," not even once. I simply held my daughter and told her that predators succeed precisely because they know how to perfectly mimic the people we most want to trust. I told her that her deep capacity to love and believe in others was something beautiful, and that she should never allow a monster to persuade her to turn that warm heart into cold stone. Later that evening, the house settled into a deep, easy quiet we hadn't felt in nearly a year. I stepped out onto the back porch carrying 2 mugs of hot peppermint tea. The autumn air was sharp and cold, carrying the familiar smell of fallen leaves and the faint drift of wood smoke from the neighbor's chimney. Vivian was already out there, curled up on the wooden porch glider, with her knees drawn to her chest, bundled tight inside an old quilted blanket. I passed her a mug and settled into the wooden rocking chair beside her, listening to the soft creak of the floorboards beneath us. We sat together in easy, unhurried silence, watching the sunset lay its colors across the evening sky, bruised purple and burning gold. This was the very spot where Carolyn and I used to sit together every night after Vivian had gone to bed. My wife and I would talk through our days, our worries, and the grand dreams we held for our daughter. Sitting there now with Vivian beside me, her mug warm in her hands, Carolyn's memory felt closer and more alive than it had in a decade. The porch had always been a place of truth and shelter for our family, and tonight it felt as though that shelter had finally been fully reclaimed. Vivian leaned her head against my shoulder and took a slow sip of her drink. She told me she had decided to take a full month away from her architectural firm to travel on her own and clear her head. She wanted to visit the quiet coastal towns her mother used to describe when she was young. She wanted to spend that time rebuilding herself, shedding the suffocating toxic weight of a man who had spent months trying to make her feel small and inadequate. I listened to her lay out those plans for her future, and my chest filled with an overwhelming pride. She was not a broken woman. She was deeply bruised, but she was already mending, growing stronger and far wiser for what she had survived. The $500,000 in the trust fund sat safely locked away, untouched and fully shielded by the law. The parasites who had come for our family were thousands of miles away, facing the hard, unavoidable consequences of their own boundless greed. Dirk was sitting in a cold holding cell in Vienna, awaiting trial for international embezzlement. Garrett and Ilsa were drowning in civil lawsuits, their pretense of aristocratic refinement shattered entirely by the reality of their enormous debts. They had tried to exploit a grieving family, and they had walked away with nothing, not a single thing left to their name. I drew a long, slow breath of cold night air and felt a deep, unshakable peace move through my tired bones. I had kept the sacred promise I made to Carolyn 10 years ago. I had shielded our daughter from the cruelty of the world, and I had guarded her legacy with every resource I had. I did not need to raise my voice to command respect from arrogant strangers. I did not need to throw scenes or manufacture chaos to prove my authority to a fraud. From the very beginning, I had allowed the enemy to completely underestimate me. I had let them believe they were the sharpest minds in the room, while I quietly studied every crack in their armor, mapped their blind spots, built a flawless, inescapable trap. As the last light of the sun dropped behind the tall oak trees and the backyard folded into quiet, peaceful dark, I understood again the central lesson of my 30 years in corporate warfare. True power is not loud or flashy. True power does not chase validation or feed on cheap applause from the people around it. It watches everything in absolute, unwavering silence. If you've made it to the end of this one, I want to say thank you genuinely. Stories like this one don't get told enough, and I'm grateful you stayed with me through every difficult turn. Looking back now, I can say, honestly, that protecting Vivian cost me sleep, cost me months of quiet dread, and nearly cost me my relationship with my own daughter. But I believe God placed the right people and the right moments of clarity in front of me, precisely when I needed them most. The timing was never mine to control. It never is. What I could control was whether I showed up prepared, clear-eyed, and unwilling to quit. These are the things this fight taught me, and I offer them to you as plainly as I know how. Never let someone's charm become a substitute for their character. Watch what a person does when they believe no one important is watching. When someone tries to isolate you from the people who love you, treat that as the warning it is. Isolation is always a tool, never an accident. Patience is not weakness. Build your case quietly, completely, and without showing your hand before the moment is right. Protect what the people you love worked hard to leave behind. A legacy is not just money, it is proof that someone's life mattered. I've shared a lot of grandpa revenge stories on this channel, and what runs through every single one of them is this: ordinary people, when pushed far enough and armed with enough preparation, are capable of extraordinary things. These father stories matter because they remind us that love is not passive. Real love does the hard, unglamorous work when it has to. If this story moved, you share it with someone who might need to hear it today. Leave your thoughts in the comments. I read more of them than you might expect. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Grandpa's Revenge so you don't miss what's coming next. Thank you for being here. Until next time, stay sharp, stay loyal, and take good care of the people who are counting on you.